Well, Shelley Silver today had a punctuation point on what has been a long, drawn-out ordeal. He got handed a 12-year prison sentence. You'll, of course, remember the former Assembly Speaker found guilty on 7 federal corruption counts in November. Our Dominic Carter, he was in the courthouse when the judge handed it down.
And good evening, Richard. 12 years, and Mr. Silver has until July 1st to report to federal prison.
Everybody step back.
Swamped by cameras afterwards, Sheldon Silver showed no emotion. His lawyers asked for community service and house arrest, but federal judge Valerie Caproni was having none of it, declaring she hopes the sentence will deter other elected officials. Not only did she hit Silver with 12 years in prison, Caproni also ordered him to pay back more than $5 million and hit him with a fine of $1.75 million.
We accept what she has done today. Obviously, we told the judge in advance we were going to appeal. We'll do it, Mr. Silver, and we respect the justice system. Hopefully, we'll get a better result then.
You've known him a long time.
Yes.
Is he ready for today?
He's a pretty steady guy. It's a tough result. We understand that.
From the bench, Judge Caproni said, quote, "Did Silver do things to be nice, or was there always something in there for him?" Adding, quote, "He doubled down on corruption." And now, Richard, we are joined by Robert Ray, a former federal prosecutor here in the Southern District, correct?
Yes.
Okay, you were here at the courthouse just a little while ago as all this went down, the mass chaos as Silver was leaving the courthouse. 12 years, surrender date of July. What do you make of the sentence?
It was a severe and, arguably harsh sentence, but as the judge explained during the sentencing proceeding, it was necessary to send a message to the public and also to politicians more specifically that corruption cannot be tolerated, that the conduct here undermined the public's confidence in the integrity of public officials generally, and in that intangible way, serious damage was done to the state of New York. And as a result of that, given what the judge viewed in context, which is a series of convictions of New York public officials over the recent past, and sentences, as she said, that ranged anywhere from probation or effectively probation to 14 years in prison, and in light of a recommendation here from the probation office of 10 years and the government's request for a sentence in excess of 14, I think she essentially tried to find some middle ground, and that's why she imposed a sentence of 12 years, but obviously not by any means lenient.
As a former federal prosecutor yourself, you were counsel on Whitewater. I was a bit taken off guard at how tough the prosecutors were. They really wanted the judge to throw the book at Mr. Silver.
Well, remember now, throwing the book under the sentencing guidelines that were calculated here are astronomically high. Some would say ridiculously high, in the neighborhood of in excess of 20 years. We're not talking about a sentence, in that on that order of magnitude. On the other hand, we're talking about a 70-year-old defendant who had survived prostate cancer, who got a sentence of 12 years, of which, under federal guidelines, he would serve 85% of that sentence. Effectively, that's a life sentence. So that's not by any means, showing an enormous amount of mercy here. I mean, I think it was, everybody understands that sentence to have been severe.
Let me close this way. Mr. Silver may not do much time in prison based on what's going on with the Supreme Court and the case in Virginia.
Well, we're a long way away from knowing that. What I will say is that the judge, I think, set the July 1 surrender date in this case. In other words, Mr. Silver will remain out on bail until July 1. To give sufficient time, because what's expected before July 1, at the end of the term, the Supreme Court will decide the Governor McDonnell case. If the Supreme Court decides, where I think what's going to happen is they'll decide in his favor, if they do so, that will have bearing on Mr. Silver's appeal. And in the immediate impact will be whether or not Judge Caproni decides to give bail to Mr. Silver pending his appeal. And I think that will in part depend on what the Supreme Court does. If the Supreme Court throws out Governor McDonnell's conviction, I think you'll look to see the likelihood that Mr. Silver will get bail on appeal in this case, and obviously we'll know the answer to that question before July 1.
And Richard, that being a former federal prosecutor talking to us on what has been a remarkable day from here in Lower Manhattan. Sheldon Silver, 12 years in prison. The judge says she's trying to accommodate his request to go to Otisville Federal Prison, which is located here in New York State. Reporting from Lower Manhattan, I'm Dominic Carter. Richard, let's go back to you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And of course, as we know, this trial not in isolation or in a vacuum. The Silver sentencing happening on the very same day that Dean Skelos' replacement was sworn in. Todd Kaminsky, he won that state Senate seat. So 2 of the 3 guys in the room have been replaced. And the third, Governor Andrew Cuomo, he is dealing with a federal investigation into the so-called Buffalo Billion. That refers to $1 billion in state money that was poured into Buffalo for economic development. The former aide to Governor Cuomo, Joe Percoco, who you see there, is the focus of that probe. Percoco, he got lucrative consulting contracts from state contractors that right after he worked for the governor's office, but was still running the governor's re-election campaign in that consultant role. Cuomo had the following to say about it.
And I've learned the hard way that sometimes what it looks like is not what it turns out to be. So before you speculate and what about this, get the facts first.
Okay, so with all that, it begs the question as to where we go from here. And I'll start first, Costas, with the reference that the former prosecutor was making to the Virginia cases before the Supreme Court. Obviously, you got a 4-4 court here with a vacancy, but nonetheless, there's a lot of prevailing wisdom that they may say, as distasteful as what McDonald did, which basically was to use his office in many ways for he and his wife or whatever to further their interest, it can be argued that that was under basically the wide purview that that's how business is done in the case of Virginia or in this case of Albany. I hope that's not the case. But nonetheless, that could have a big bearing on how much time, if at all, Silver sees behind bars.
Yeah, and it's unclear how that will go, but I think this is all unfolding in a more broad general climate of real concern in the public about political corruption. And just like the judge in the Silver case made a decision to send a message about the fact that corruption will not be tolerated, maybe the Supreme Court will do something similar in that it will send a strong message to the American public about what's appropriate for elected officials and political, politicians to be doing in office.
That message necessarily gets through because there's such a political class surrounding a lot of these individuals, and they work to game the system as best they can. It's like an accountant at tax time. You know, if you know the tax law, you can figure out how to get around the tax law. I think a lot of these guys operate under the same principle. Here are the rules, so here's how I can skirt those rules and still get the money in from those. You know, I agree with the sentence, but I don't know if that sends the message that perhaps the judge is thinking it does.
And I'll tell you, Scott, for me, one of the most distressing things that I've seen in the last year and a half covering these stories and these cases and everything else is the rank cynicism that people have, which is they weren't shocked about the Silver case or the Skelos case. They believe it's happening every day. Now, I take the unpopular position to tell them, not that I'm taking up for Brodsky all the time, right? He does a good enough job promoting himself, but that it's not true. Most of them, they're not crooks. But the prevailing wisdom, not just of the general public, but a lot of folks that are around this is, please, the other ones just haven't been caught yet. And that's been the worst, I think, indictment in this whole story, is that it's just fed into the idea that out of sight, out of mind, you know what those guys are doing with our money.
You're right, and it's really sad because the thousands and thousands of people who serve properly, honestly, or open, accommodating what they're supposed to be doing and nothing more, are dismissed, and I think it's driving the Trump and the Sanders campaign. Honestly, I think people are just fed up, and you know what? This whole thing with the Cuomo and the Buffalo Billion, I mean, this is deep. This is not just a question of somebody getting money when he was off the state payroll. It's a question of how those folks got jobs, billions of dollars worth of contracts.
And you know what? For folks, if you look on your own into the story, but Percoco, when he was a consultant, allegedly, this is what's out there, got, in effect, stipends of 70 and 50 grand from two people who had business before the state. We'll let it play out if it was legitimate payments for services rendered, or if there was either an unspoken or more of a quid pro quo, you do this, we'll help you land some contracts. But nonetheless, we're talking about 100 grand here or so, right?
And to his wife.
Right, to his wife. And I'm not saying that's chump change, that's real money. But think about how little it takes to buy influence in Albany. That's the thing that always at least shocks me. Like, remember Governor Rowland? He went down for a 50 grand shed in the back of his house near Hartford, right? For me, it's always, my gosh, how cheap it is to buy influence, you know? You're talking about $1 billion, and that's what it takes, you know?
Yeah, well, of course, and they also gave to the campaign for Cuomo that he was running while he was getting money from them separately. And the question of the legality is one thing, but if you put all this together, man, there's a lot of smoke. I mean, there's, and you know what? Getting to your point, all it does is it just exacerbates this whole notion of the public seeing everybody up there on the top is crooked.
And it's not really a matter of how much money, you know, the actual amount of money. It's really more a matter of the principle and what kind of people we're electing to public office, people who are corrupted and corruptible, and that's really something that you
just don't know.
You don't know.
And for me, say whatever you want, but Cuomo, former Attorney General, former member of the, I mean, nobody accused him of, and nobody has, okay? But if you can't trust a former AG, you think, who can you, okay? And again, very preliminary, we're going to follow this story, but to Scott's point, it's not going away anytime soon. All right, coming up next, we are going even closer to home, this one locally, on why many are saying it is not a good day for the county of Westchester. Affordable housing case coming to a head again, and it could head to the court here with the feds getting involved. Also, new Playland deal could cost taxpayers a lot of green. I'm not talking about play money. Stay with us.